I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. Winston Churchill, June 18th, 1940. In the summer of 1940, Britain had her back against the wall. In June, the disastrous Dunkirk campaign had ended with a miracle as more than 300,000 battered and beleaguered British and Allied troops were rescued by sea from the French coast. These men were spared captivity and could instead fight against the Axis powers over the next 5 years. The new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, steeled himself and his people for the difficult task ahead, standing alone against the Nazi threat of Western Europe. France, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway had all fallen in the spring and early summer. Spain and Sweden, nominally neutral, were partners with the Axis powers. Ireland, having broken from Britain 2 decades before, also declared neutrality. Britain and her associated Commonwealth nations stood alone. The United States had not yet entered the war. Should the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force fail, Britain would be open to invasion from Nazi Germany. Hitler, of course, understood this and began sending flights of bombers across the Channel, with the primary objective being to cripple the Royal Air Force in preparation for a general invasion. The Nazis targeted radar stations, airfields, and aircraft manufacturing. From July to October, the Germans flew sorties against Britain, losing nearly 2,000 aircraft and between 2,500 and 3,500 pilots, not including air crews. At the same time, the British lost approximately 1,000 aircraft and 500 pilots. The British pilots were at an advantage in the event of being shot down, as downed British pilots could sometimes return to combat the same day with a different aircraft, whereas German pilots and crews shot down over Britain were captured and therefore out of action. As the Battle of Britain wound down, it became apparent to the Nazis that they would not be able to simply destroy the RAF. In September, they began the systematic bombing of London and other key British industrial and commercial centers. In October, the last month of the Battle of Britain, the Nazis switched from day to night attacks. These raids were not pinpoint attacks designed to hit only industrial targets. In the course of this strategic bombing campaign, which became known as the Blitz, civilian targets suffered alongside military and industrial facilities. Civilian fire crews battled the blazes that inevitably came from German incendiary bombs. As the Blitz wore on, British resolve increased, as did their technological countermeasures such as radar. By May of 1941, the Germans had abandoned their strategy and shifted their resources elsewhere. Throughout the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood as a symbol of national resistance. Grim and determined, he led Britain through her darkest hour. Yet he was a man accustomed to adversity. The eldest son of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and an American heiress, Churchill's parents neglected and disdained him as a child. He was often left in the care of governesses until he was sent away to school at Harrow, where he often wrote to his parents. Following his time at Harrow, he attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where his performance still failed to impress his mother and father. Afterwards, he became a cavalry officer and a newspaper correspondent who saw action in the Cuban War of Independence, on the northwest frontier in India, and in Sudan. Later, he joined British forces in the Boer War as a correspondent, where he was captured after an attack on the train that he was traveling in. He escaped captivity and returned to England, where he soon ran for a seat in the House of Commons. His political career would continue on the upswing into the First World War, when, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he was held responsible for the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. After this fall, he rejoined the army, fighting on the front lines in France. He occupied a number of ministerial positions throughout the 1920s before returning to his comparatively obscure status as a member of parliament. As Hitler rose in power, Churchill was among the anti-appeasers, British leaders who thought that granting Hitler's demands for more territory would only lead to further Nazi aggression. He rejoined the cabinet in 1939 and became prime minister in May 1940, just as the British Expeditionary Force was being bottled up by the Nazis in France. Following the German defeat in the Battle of Britain and the failure of the Blitz, Churchill continued to serve as a symbol of British defiance. Early in 1941, the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act, which opened the flow of war material to Britain. Churchill would lead Britain for the rest of the war in Europe, though he would be ousted as prime minister mere weeks before Japan's capitulation and the end of the war. Nonetheless, he had by then cemented his place in British history as a national hero and would enjoy one more stint in office as prime minister during the 1950s, a symbolic figure in Britain's long history of opposition to tyranny.